What would you do if the only inheritance left to you was a ruin? If the world, in its cold and final judgment, handed you a deed to a place long surrendered to rot and memory, a place whispered about in ghost stories, and called it your portion? For Annie Pendleton, this was not a question of fancy, but the hard, cobbled reality of a Tuesday morning in the market town of Henley-on-Wold. She was given a crumbling manor for the price of her dignity, a transaction that was meant to be the end of her story. But the truth, waiting inside those decaying walls, was not an ending, but a beginning of the most unexpected kind. Settle in, and let us travel back to that gray afternoon and see what happens when something that is thrown away refuses to be forgotten. The door of the Pendleton Mercantile shut behind her with a final, unforgiving click. Annie Pendleton stood on the damp flagstones, the sound echoing the closing of a chapter in her life she had never asked to write. In her hand, she clutched a small, worn purse containing a few shillings, and in her other, a brittle, yellowed document tied with a faded ribbon. George Pendleton, her brother-in-law, had pressed it into her hand with a smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Your late grandfather's estate," he had announced, his voice loud enough for the clerks and customers to hear. "Blackwood Grange. Entirely yours now. A fitting inheritance, I think." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. An inheritance of rot, of isolation, of final dismissal. 6 months. It had been only 6 months since his brother, her Thomas, had been taken by the fever, his last breaths shallow in the narrow bed of their rented rooms. In that time, Annie had gone from wife to widow, from family to burden. The Pendletons, so proud of their standing in Henley-on-Wold, could not abide the pale, quiet ghost of their second son's unfortunate marriage. She was a reminder of a lesser branch, a girl from a family with a name but no fortune. Her presence was an inconvenience, and George, ever the pragmatist, had just tidied it away. She felt the weight of a dozen gazes from the windows of the high street, the swift turn of a head, the hushed murmur behind a gloved hand. She was 22 years old, and utterly, irrevocably alone. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. Thomas, his hand frail in hers, his face slick with sweat. "They don't understand you, Annie," he had whispered. "You see things they walk right past." At the time, she had thought he was merely delirious. Now his words felt like a prophecy. She looked down at the deed. Blackwood Grange. She had never seen it. It was a place from cautionary tales her own mother used to tell, a collapsed and forgotten manor on the edge of the wild woods, abandoned since her grandfather, a man they called an eccentric, had died decades ago. It was said to be haunted by damp and sorrow, and it was now her only refuge. With a slow, deliberate breath, she straightened her thin shoulders. The wind whipped a strand of brown hair across her face, and she did not brush it away. Her gaze lifted from the mocking cobblestones at her feet and settled on the dark line of trees that fringed the distant hills. Somewhere in there, her inheritance was waiting. She found Elias Webb loading sacks of grain onto his cart near the edge of the market square. He was a man from her own village, a man who had known her since she was a girl, with scuffed boots and bramble-scratched knees, long before she had become Mrs. Thomas Pendleton. He looked up as she approached, his weathered face creasing with a kindness she had not seen in months. He did not ask what had happened. He saw it in the set of her jaw, in the worn valise at her feet. "Where to, Annie?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Blackwood Grange," she replied, the name feeling strange and heavy on her tongue. Elias paused, his hands on a burlap sack. He looked at her, then at the distant woods, and simply nodded. "Get in," he said. The journey was mostly silent, the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the cartwheels, a somber sort of music. When they reached the turnoff, a lane so overgrown with hawthorn and ivy it was barely a track, Elias pulled the horse to a halt. "This is as far as the cart will go," he said, helping her down. He unloaded her small trunk, the sum of her worldly possessions. From a satchel, he produced a heavy loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, and a dented tin lantern with a stub of a candle inside. "You'll need these," he said, pressing them into her hands. "The nights are cold." She could offer no payment, and he asked for none. He simply touched the brim of his hat and turned the cart around, leaving her standing at the mouth of the forgotten lane. She walked for what felt like a mile, the path closing in around her, the air growing cooler and smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. Then the trees parted, and she saw it. Blackwood Grange was not a house. It was a skeleton. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine, slates missing like lost teeth. The windows were dark, vacant eyes, many of them boarded over. The stone walls, once a handsome gray, were stained nearly black with years of relentless damp, and a thick cloak of ivy consumed the entire eastern wing. It was worse than the stories. It was a monument to abandonment. A side door, meant for the kitchens, had rotted through at the bottom. She pushed, and it fell inward with a groan of splintering wood. The air that rushed out to meet her was thick and cold, a composite scent of wet stone, mouse droppings, and something else beneath it all. Something ancient and loamy, like the floor of a forest. She stepped inside. Dust motes danced like fairies in the single shaft of gray light piercing the gloom. She made her way to the great hall, a cavernous space where a tattered tapestry hung from the wall like a flayed skin. She set her trunk down in the center of the floor and sat upon it, the silence so profound it seemed to have a physical weight. This was her castle. This was her portion. This was home. Was this a tomb or a sanctuary? What secret could such a place of profound decay possibly hold that the world had overlooked for so long? Let us know in the comments what you would do if you were in Annie's shoes, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten places and hidden truths. But as Annie sat there in the deepening twilight, she began to realize the house was not as empty or as silent as it first appeared. A week passed in a blur of labor and solitude. To survive, Annie knew she must first make a single corner of the ruin her own. She chose the vast kitchen, for it had a cavernous hearth and a floor of solid flagstone that had not yet surrendered to the damp. She found a rusty pail and a stiff-bristled broom, and began the Herculean task of clearing away the debris of decades. She swept out layers of dust, leaves, and the tiny bones of birds and mice that had sought shelter and found their end. She scrubbed the grime from the stones until her hands were raw and red, her knuckles bleeding. The small purse from George Pendleton dwindled quickly. She walked the 2 miles to the nearby village of Oakhaven, a place that eyed her with open suspicion. The whispers followed her from the moment she stepped onto the single street. They knew the Pendleton name, and they knew of the disgraced widow, sent to live in the haunted grange. In the general store, the proprietor served her with a clipped sort of courtesy, his eyes never quite meeting hers. Children, emboldened by their parents' silence, pointed at her mended dress and worn-out boots. She bought flour, salt, and a little lard, feeling the weight of their judgment like a physical cloak. As she was leaving, a horse and rider trotted into the village, and her heart sank. It was George, his face flushed with prosperity, his riding coat impeccably tailored. He saw her at once, and a cruel, amused smile spread across his face. He reined in his horse, deliberately blocking her path. "Well, well, the lady of the manor," he boomed, for all to hear. "Come to town for supplies? I trust the rats are proving to be accommodating tenants." He laughed, a short, barking sound, and the villagers who had been watching from their doorways shuffled their feet, some offering thin, nervous smiles in his direction. Without waiting for a reply, he spurred his horse and cantered away, leaving her standing in a cloud of dust and quiet humiliation. She turned to leave, her face burning, and a voice, dry and crackling as autumn leaves, stopped her. "Miss Pendleton." An old woman sat on a bench by the churchyard wall, a figure so still Annie had scarcely noticed her. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes a pale, faded blue. "I am Elspeth. I knew your grandfather." Annie stopped, surprised. "He was a strange man," they said, Elspeth continued, her gaze fixed on the distant roof of the grange, just visible through the trees. But he saw what others could not. She paused, and her next words were spoken so softly, Annie had to lean in to hear them. He always said the damp was the secret, not the enemy. And that was all. The old woman fell silent, her attention returning to the slow, methodical work of knitting. Annie murmured a thank you, and continued on her way back to the manor, the strange, cryptic sentence turning over and over in her mind. The damp was the secret. What could that possibly mean? The damp was rot. It was decay. It was the very thing that was consuming her inheritance, devouring the timbers, and turning the plaster to powder. It was her greatest adversary in this lonely place. As she walked the overgrown lane, the house rising before her like a great, dark beast, Elspeth's words echoed, nonsensical and persistent. What secret could damp possibly hold? The days grew shorter, the autumn air sharper. Annie's life fell into a simple, grueling rhythm. Wake, work, eat, sleep. She managed to clear one of the great chimneys of nesting birds and debris, and for the first time, in what must have been 40 years, a fire flickered and caught in the kitchen hearth. The warmth was a small miracle, a pocket of defiance against the encroaching cold of the house. The weather was a constant companion, a character in her solitary play. Days of gray, persistent drizzle would give way to mornings of thick, rolling fog that muffled all sound and made the world outside her window disappear. The manor groaned and settled around her, a living thing breathing in the damp air. It was in the old, collapsed stables that she found she was not entirely alone. A dog, a lanky hound of indeterminate breed, was living there. He was little more than a shadow of fur and bone, his coat the color of dried moss, his eyes wary and intelligent. He would not let her near, melting back into the darkness of the stalls if she took a step too close. Every day, she left a small piece of her bread on a stone near the stable door. For 3 days, it remained untouched. On the 4th morning, it was gone. She gave him a name, in her mind at least. She called him Moss. He was her silent witness as she explored the ground floor of the manor, room by shuttered, echoing room. She pried open the boards from the windows, letting in weak, watery sunlight. She found furniture draped in dust sheets, standing like an assembly of ghosts in the gloom. A library with leather-bound books swollen and ruined by damp. A drawing room where a grand piano stood with its keys yellowed and silent. In the dining hall, the long table was set with dusty porcelain, as if awaiting guests who had never arrived. Portraits of her ancestors watched her from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress, their expressions stern and unreadable. She slept on a pallet of old sacking she'd found, dragged close to the kitchen fire. The house was a symphony of strange noises at night. The incessant drip of water, somewhere deep within its bowels, the scuttling of unseen creatures in the walls, the mournful howl of the wind in the newly cleared chimney. It was a cold and haunted place, but it was hers. It had not cast her out. One evening, as the rain hammered against the window panes, a shadow fell across the kitchen doorway. It was Moss. He stood there, dripping, hesitating. She did not move, did not speak. After a long moment, he padded silently into the room, circled 3 times, and lay down on the flagstones before the fire, with a heavy sigh. He was still wary, but he had chosen to come inside. His presence was a comfort, a small, warm weight against the vast emptiness of the house. But that night, another sound joined the chorus, a sound that kept her from any real rest. It was a rhythmic, steady dripping, not from the roof, but from somewhere deep below the floor. A sound that seemed to be counting out the seconds in the heart of the house. The sound drew her, a persistent, metronomic heartbeat from the cellar. She found the door in a dark passageway off the kitchen. A heavy slab of oak, gray with age, and swollen tight in its stone frame. It had no handle, only a small iron ring. She pulled, her boots slipping on the flagstones, her muscles straining. For a long time, it refused to yield. Then, with a great, sucking groan of wood against stone, it scraped open just enough for her to squeeze through. The air that rose to meet her was not the foul, stagnant breath of a tomb she had expected. It was cool, clean, and alive with a scent she couldn't place. A smell of deep earth, wet rock, and something else, something faintly sweet and herbal, like crushed thyme after a rain. Holding the lantern high, she descended the worn stone steps. The cellar was vast, far larger than she had imagined, a labyrinth of vaulted stone archways. And it was not empty. Her lantern light fell upon an extraordinary sight. Running the length of the far wall was a series of long, shallow troughs, expertly crafted from slate and arranged in tiered rows. A slow, controlled trickle of water, clear as glass, flowed from a channel carved into the wall, feeding each trough in turn before disappearing into a drain in the floor. This was no accidental flood. It was a deliberate, intricate system of irrigation, and in the troughs, something was growing. It was a carpet of moss, but unlike any she had ever seen. It was a deep, velvety emerald, so vibrant it seemed to drink the lantern light and glow with a life of its own. Here and there, patches of a silvery green lichen grew among it, clinging to the damp slate. This was the source of the clean, sweet smell. This was the source of the rhythmic dripping she had heard. It was the sound of water feeding this secret, subterranean garden. She ran her fingers over the surface of the moss. It was cool and soft as velvet. This was not neglect. This was cultivation. This was craft. The old woman, Elspeth's words, returned to her with sudden, shocking clarity. He always said the damp was the secret, not the enemy. Her grandfather had not fought the water that bled from the earth beneath his house. He had harnessed it. He had tamed it. He had used it to grow this. Why? What purpose could this strange, beautiful, hidden crop possibly serve? She moved the lantern along the wall, the light dancing across the glowing green fields. Her gaze fell upon something half-hidden behind the last of the troughs, something that didn't belong. It was a small door, made not of wood, but of solid iron, set deep into the stone foundation of the house. It was dark with rust, and a heavy, formidable lock was bolted across it. A chill, entirely separate from the cold of the cellar, traced its way down her spine. The moss was a marvel, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the real secret of Blackwood Grange lay behind that locked iron door. For days, the cellar became Annie's entire world. She learned its rhythms, its quiet language. In the morning, a single shaft of light from a high, barred grate would spear through the gloom, illuminating a patch of the moss and making it blaze with color. She watched the slow, patient journey of the water through the slate channels, a system so perfectly balanced that every part of the garden received its share. Moss, the dog, would follow her down the stone steps and lie quietly in a corner, his head on his paws, a silent, watchful companion in the subterranean world. Her attention, however, was fixed on the iron door. The lock was a solid mass of rust, the keyhole clogged with the debris of ages. She tried to clear it, to find some way to turn the mechanism, but it was fused shut. Frustrated, she searched the outbuildings, the stables, and forgotten workshops for a tool that might give her the leverage she needed. She found it in a corner of the blacksmith's forge, a long, heavy crowbar, its surface pitted with rust, but its iron heart still strong. It took her the better part of an afternoon. The work was brutal, jarring her arms and shoulders with every blow. She wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam between the door and its frame, and threw her entire weight against it, again and again. The sound of metal screeching against stone echoed through the cellar. Sweat dripped from her brow, and her hands were raw and blistered. Finally, with a deafening crack, the rusted lockplate shattered, and the iron door swung inward into blackness. She waited for her breath to return, then raised her lantern and stepped across the threshold. She was in a small, dry stone chamber, an anomaly in the damp-soaked cellar. It was a hidden study. A simple wooden desk and chair stood in the center of the room. Against the walls were shelves, and on them, a collection of glass jars filled with dried powders of varying colors, and a neat row of leather-bound notebooks. It was her grandfather's workshop, a secret heart sealed away from the world. With a trembling hand, she took down the first notebook. The pages were filled with elegant, precise script and detailed botanical drawings. It was a journal. It was his life's work. She sat at the desk and began to read. Her grandfather, Arthur Pendleton, had been more than an eccentric. He was a master botanist and a patient genius. He had spent 30 years cultivating what he called lumen muscus, or light moss. Through painstaking crossbreeding and selection, he had developed a unique symbiotic culture of moss and lichen that, when harvested and processed in a very specific way, yielded a dye of unparalleled quality, a green of impossible vibrancy and permanence. The notebooks were a meticulous record of his obsession. There were formulae for mordants, detailed instructions for drying and grinding the moss, notes on the precise temperature of the water needed for the dye bath. It was a complete and perfect recipe for a lost art, a treasure born not of gold or silver, but of damp, stone, and patience. She read late into the night, the only sounds the soft turning of a page and the quiet breathing of the dog at her feet. She reached the final entry in the last journal, written in a hand made shaky by age. It was a single, cryptic sentence. After all this time, the final catalyst is found. It is not a mineral, but a memory. The ash from a willing fire. She read the words again, but they made no sense. What could he possibly mean? Annie carried the knowledge of the journals like a secret fire. The world above was a place of gray skies and bare trees, but in her cellar, a vibrant green promise was waiting. She began the work, following her grandfather's meticulous instructions. With a small pair of shears she'd found in the workshop, she carefully harvested a handful of the lumen muscus, the velvety fronds cool and damp against her fingers. Moss the dog watched her every move, a silent, furry supervisor. In the great kitchen hearth, she set up her laboratory. She used a heavy iron cauldron, scoured clean of rust, and measured out the rainwater she had collected in a barrel. She ground the dried moss with a stone pestle and mortar, reducing it to a fine, fragrant green powder. She followed the recipes for the mordants, alum and cream of tartar, purchased on her last trip to Oakhaven, and prepared the dye bath exactly as the journals instructed. The liquid in the pot turned a promising shade of green, and she dipped a test strip of old linen into the mixture, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. She waited the prescribed time, then pulled it out. The result was a dull, muddy olive brown, a pale imitation of the living moss, flat and lifeless. It was a failure. She tried again, adjusting the temperature, the timing, the quantities. Each time, the result was the same, a dispiriting, stagnant green. Something was missing, the final catalyst. Exhausted and discouraged, she returned to the hidden study and sat at her grandfather's desk, rereading the final, cryptic entry, the ash from a willing fire. What was a willing fire? A fire of sacrifice? A fire made of something precious? Her eyes scanned the dusty shelves and fell upon a small, intricately carved wooden box she hadn't noticed before. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were the brittle, preserved remains of a small bouquet of wildflowers, and beneath them, a single, folded letter. The letter was from her grandfather to his late wife, written on the anniversary of her death. He wrote of his profound loneliness, of how the world had lost its color when she was gone. He explained that his work with the moss, his obsessive quest for the perfect, living green, was his attempt to capture and preserve the color of her eyes, the color of the hills on the day they had met. It was an act of love, an act of devotion. At the end, he wrote, "I have finally done it, my love. I have made a green that will never fade. I burned our letters, all of them, in the hearth. Their ash was the key. A fire of memory was all it needed. A fire of memory. A willing fire." Annie's hand went to a small locket she wore around her neck. Inside was not a portrait, but a tiny, folded piece of paper. It was the only letter she had from Thomas, written before they were married, a simple note, full of hope for their future together. It was her most precious possession, the last tangible piece of him she had left in the world. She held the locket in her hand, the metal cool against her skin. To bring her grandfather's legacy to life, did she have to sacrifice her own? The autumn broke. A great storm, born somewhere in the vast gray Atlantic, rolled in and settled over the countryside. For 3 days, the rain did not cease, lashing against the grange in wind-driven sheets. The ground, already saturated, could take no more. The small stream that ran through the woods swelled into a muddy torrent, and the water table began to rise. At first, it was just a few dark patches on the cellar floor. But soon, water began to seep in through a dozen tiny cracks in the old foundation. Not the clean spring water of her grandfather's channels, but a murky, silt-laden flood. The journals had been explicit. Contaminated water would be death to the delicate cultures. The silt would choke them, the unknown minerals poisoning their fragile balance. The troughs were in danger of being overwhelmed. Annie worked with a frantic, desperate energy. She used old buckets to bail the rising water, her arms aching, her back screaming in protest. She hauled stones from the collapsed garden wall, trying to build a dam, to divert the flow. But it was like trying to stop the tide with her bare hands. Moss barked and whined at her side, sensing her rising panic, his agitation a mirror of her own. The storm reached its zenith on the 3rd night. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the rain hammered down with relentless fury. As she worked in the flickering lantern light, soaked through and shivering, a new sound reached her over the din of the storm, a desperate banging at the main door. Her first thought was of George, come to mock her even in this deluge. But the fists that beat upon the oak were frantic, not cruel. She unbarred the door to find a man, his face a mask of desperation, shielding a woman and a small boy from the driving rain. "Please!" the man shouted over the wind. "Our cart. The axle broke on the lane. My wife. The baby is coming." He was a traveler, a carpenter by the look of his hands, and his wife was heavily pregnant, her face pale with pain and exhaustion. Without a moment's hesitation, Annie ushered them inside. She led them to the kitchen, the only warm, dry place in the house, stirred the fire to a blaze, and gave them her last piece of bread and the blanket from her own bed. After ensuring they were settled, she turned back to the cellar. The water was higher now, lapping at the edges of the lowest slate trough. She was exhausted, cold, and on the verge of defeat. She could not save it, not alone. And in that moment of surrender, a strange clarity came to her. She looked at the rising water, at the life's work of her grandfather, about to be extinguished. She thought of the new life, about to begin upstairs. She walked to the hearth, took the locket from her neck, and opened it. She unfolded the small, precious letter from Thomas, read his hopeful words one last time, and whispered a quiet goodbye. Then, she dropped it into the flames. She watched until it was nothing but a curl of white ash, a willing fire. She carefully collected the ash, her hands steady now, and mixed it into one small, prepared pot of the dye. As the storm raged outside, and a new life cried out its first breath upstairs, she dipped a clean scrap of white linen into the mixture. The linen emerged from the cauldron transformed. It was not the muddy olive of her failed experiments, but a green of impossible life and depth. It was the color of new leaves in the first sun of spring, the color of deep forest pools, the color of a perfect emerald held to the light. It did not seem like a dye, but as if the cloth itself had been imbued with a living essence. It was perfect. At dawn, the storm finally broke. The wind died down, and the rain softened to a gentle drizzle before stopping altogether. Annie returned to the cellar to find that the floodwaters had begun to recede. The moss cultures were damaged, coated in a thin layer of silt, but they were alive. The delicate ecosystem had held. Upstairs, the carpenter's wife was resting, a healthy newborn son bundled in her arms. The family stayed for 2 more days. The father, whose name was John, was a man of quiet skill. In gratitude for her shelter, he spent a full day in the cellar with her, using his knowledge of stone and mortar to find and seal the cracks in the foundation, making it stronger than it had been before. When they left, he wrung her hand. "The world should know of the kindness in this house," he said, and went on his way. His words traveled faster than she could have imagined. In the market towns and villages, the story began to change. The tale of the disgraced Pendleton widow, living in a ruin, was replaced by whispers of the resourceful woman at Blackwood Grange, the one who gave shelter in the storm. John the carpenter spoke of her to a wool merchant in Shrewsbury, who in turn mentioned it to a textile agent from Manchester, a man named Mr. Davies, who was always searching for new colors, new innovations. The agent, intrigued by the carpenter's passionate description of a green that holds the light, made the long journey to Oakhaven. He arrived at the Grange unannounced, a skeptic in a fine city coat. Annie received him with quiet dignity. She did not offer a long story or a grand explanation. She simply showed him the small square of dyed linen. Mr. Davies took the cloth in his hands. He held it to the light. He stared, his professional cynicism melting away into pure astonishment. He had spent his life trading in dyes from all over the world, but he had never seen a color like this. He performed his own tests, rubbing it, washing it in harsh soap. The color held fast. It did not run. It did not fade. It did not yield its brilliance. He looked at Annie, at the crumbling manor around them, and saw not ruin, but a revolution. He offered her a contract on the spot, one that would pay for the full restoration of the house and its unique gardens, and would make her a partner in a venture that would bring Blackwood Green to the world. Soon after, George Pendleton heard the news. He rode out from Henley-on-Wold, his face a mask of disbelief. He saw the first signs of repair, the new slates on the roof, the quiet determination in his sister-in-law's eyes. She showed him the color. He stared at the vibrant scrap of cloth, a color born from the very decay he had mocked, and for the first time in his life, he was left utterly without words. He turned his horse and rode away, humbled by the value of what he had so carelessly thrown away. A year later, the light of a soft autumn evening settled over Blackwood Grange. The house no longer sagged in defeat. Its stone walls had been repointed, its windows glazed and shining, and a steady curl of welcoming smoke rose from its main chimney. The gardens, once a tangled wilderness, were being slowly, patiently reclaimed. The old rose bushes pruned, the pathways cleared. The manor was breathing again. Annie stood at the edge of the woods, looking back at the house that was now truly her home. Moss, no longer a gaunt stray, but a strong and healthy companion, rested his gray-muzzled head against her hand. The Grange was alive, not just with the sounds of repair, but with the quiet hum of purpose. In the outbuildings, which now served as dye workshops, 2 apprentices from Oakhaven village worked, learning the patient art of tending the moss and preparing the dyes. The cellar, once a place of secrets, was now the clean, well-lit heart of a thriving enterprise. The solicitor from the nearby town, a kind and competent man named Mr. Gable, had been to visit that afternoon. He had brought the final papers, securing her grandfather's patents and processes under her own name, protecting his legacy for generations to come. Arthur Pendleton was a man ahead of his time, Mr. Gable had said, his voice holding a note of quiet reverence. He would be very proud of you, Miss Pendleton. She watched as the setting sun bathed the old stones in a warm, golden light. She had done more than repair a building. She had honored a life, resurrected a lost art, and in doing so, had built a foundation for herself far stronger than stone and mortar. She had found her place in the world, not through the name of a husband or the inheritance of coin, but through her own 2 hands, through patience, and through a willingness to see the beauty in what everyone else had dismissed as worthless. The Manchester agent, Mr. Davies, had asked her recently what she planned to officially name the remarkable color. She had put him off, saying she needed to think. Now, standing here in the quiet twilight, the answer felt simple and clear. It was a color born of memory, of sacrifice, and of hope blooming in a dark place. It is not a color, she said quietly, to moss and to the listening evening air. It is a memory of what is worth keeping. Thank you for staying with us to the very end of Annie's story. It's a quiet reminder that our true inheritance is often found in the courage to care for what the world has forgotten. If you were moved by her journey of finding strength in solitude, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next tale of loss, discovery, and quiet triumph.